Hello, ARC family. Welcome to the ARC journey. We're back with Dr. Guy, and he's sharing with us the God story of the ARC. And pictured with Dr. Guy today is John Hickernell. So, if you would take it away, Rob.
Yep. Well, this picture, this photograph of John Hickernell, we actually have the original of this uh, picture. It was rescued by Lester Thornton out of the Pittsburgh church when that church closed and stuff was scattering to the wind. He didn't think something like that should just disappear. So he saved it for us. It's the original is it's about an 18 by 24. Uh, so it's a very nice, uh, clear photograph of this man. And if you're not familiar with who he is, John Hickernell was one of two significant brothers in the Church of God. His older brother Thomas basically was the primary missionary to Ohio. And when the West Pennsylvania stuff started happening, John Hickernell was basically designated to oversee the work in Western Pennsylvania. So if you ever look at any of the histories of the churches at Alverton or Barkeyville or Lilyville, they will list John Hickernell as their first pastor. And that's basically because when he was put in charge of this area, he was um, overseeing basically all of Western Pennsylvania. You'll sometimes read it that it was 5 counties. But those were the 5 early counties before they divided into all the other counties. And so he actually talked about his circuit being about 260 or 270 miles that he would travel on horseback. And picture this, picture it being January, because that's when one of the early meetings was to organize the church there in Venango County. Um, his house, like I said, was in Alverton. You know how far of a drive it is from Alverton to Barkeyville. Picture yourself on a horse in January. But that's what he would do. They did not meet every week because it was not possible to travel like that. But he would leave, it was actually Bethany, which is now Ruffsdale, which is where Hickernell's church or house is. He would leave Ruffsdale and he would travel north to historic Harmony and to where Lilyville is. And he would stop there, preach there. And then when he was recovered and done there, he would move north up into Venango County, do the same here, spend a few days. They didn't always just meet on Sundays. They met whenever the pastor could be there to hold that service. Of course, the rest of the church met whenever they, could get together like that. So I think there was a regularity of their worship and their gathering, but it wasn't always combined with the pastor being there to provide a sermon to them. I think that's somewhat instructive to us today
Hmm.
because we think things all have to go a certain way, but they gathered to be together, to encourage one another, to worship together. And when the preacher could be there, that was great. Um, but Hickernell, I had hoped to be able to read a little bit about his some of his thoughts and some of his conversion experience. But over Christmas, I tidied up, and tidying up means I lose things. So the book that I wanted to read from today, I'll find eventually. But he and his brother Thomas were converted at a meeting in East Penn under the direct ministry of John Weinbrenner. So there's a close relationship between them. And sometimes you wonder, when Weinbrenner gets old, who the successor is going to be. It's not these guys because they were more Weinbrenner's understudies and contemporaries, and they were younger than him, of course, but they were very much the drivers of that first generation. So, in a sense, Weinbrenner can be seen as the birth of our tribe altogether, but he's primarily associated with Eastern Pennsylvania. Thomas Hickernell is primarily associated with Ohio, and John Hickernell is primarily associated with Western Pennsylvania. And that's, they basically just settled in, lived out the rest of their days as leaders, and they died and are buried where they spent their lives. And it's good for us to know their names. It's good to know their faces. I wish we had as nice a picture of Thomas as we have of John, but I've never seen a good one of Thomas. It's more just the etching. But this is an actual photograph. But uh, it's important to know these guys were assigned to communities. The communities were already in place. And the more you dig into the details of each of those communities, as a historian, it's confusing. It's complicated stuff. And I'm not by nature a genealogist, but you've got to dig into the genealogies because it was these families that were together. And to understand the whats and the whys and the wherefores, you've got to dig into those families. I think I'll start in Alverton because that's an interesting story down there. But the first thing you need to know about all three, there were four original churches in the Allegheny region. Um, we call it Barkeyville. It was called Irwin Township, Venango County. Um, then there was Harmony, which was the old Harmonite community that was purchased by the Mennonites. And then there was Lilyville, which was originally the Slippery Rock community. Has nothing to do with the Slippery Rock where the university is now, except that they share the same river. But the Lilyville community was started out as the Slippery Rock one because there's a community right along the end of the Slippery Rock Creek. But that church eventually became known as the Hickernell Church of God. And to this day, it's on Hickernell Road, named after this guy, of course. And the interesting thing about him is, nobody around that area knows who he is because he didn't live there. He just kind of passed through all the time. And the road got named after him because he found a shortcut that he would take, and he cut that path that actually borders the place where I grew up, and um, so I was drawn to Hickernell as soon as I found out he was a real person, and had a lot to do with that Lilyville church where I grew up. But his home, as I said before, is down there in Ruffsdale. I don't know that area, surrounding area well enough to be able to talk about it intelligently, but I know which house it is. I can drive right to it. It's just up the road from where Nick Ritz's place was. Not sure if Nick still owns that or whatever, but that was the old town of Bethany. And the Bethany, that's where Rosenberger was. And I mentioned Rosenberger in the last episode, and it was Rosenberger that gave these folks some shelter. And one of the important things to remember about these early days is they did not have buildings. They did not need buildings. It was a personal, relational, family kind of a gathering, and they met in homes. And they met in homes until they couldn't stay in those homes anymore because they needed more space. And it was only then that they started building buildings. There was a building there in Bethany, um, uh, that was the old Bethany Church. And if memory serves me right, I think that's the one. There was a property dispute that led them to lose that building. But they met in that building for the longest time. I remember Nick Ritz pointing back over the hill where that building used to be. A second one was in the Landis community. I think the local name used to be Hawkeye. I don't know if people still talk about Hawkeye down there or not, but the Landis family, if you know anything about that family, they came from East Penn because that was a prominent. There's Landisville there and the old Landis community there, and they migrated to Western Pennsylvania early, and they had their own Church of God community there at Hawkeye. And then that's one of the communities that left very early to go out into Iowa. And they started our first church out in Iowa. And it was their granddaughter that was our first missionary to India, Clara Landis. And it's a beautiful legacy when you tie that all together. It gives us a sense of what the churches of God was like in its first century. It did not take long for them to get from eastern Pennsylvania to west Pennsylvania to Iowa to India. That's you're talking 3 generations, and but they were. It was about the gospel, and it was about following what the Lord was leading you to do, calling you to do. And incidentally, we'll talk more about Clara Landis someday, but she was ordained in the Churches of God, sent as a Church of God minister to India in 1896. And that's just, again, who we are. Uh, the other thing about that, before I name the third community in Alverton, is the Mennonite strand. I will unpack this in future episodes, but you cannot understand the Allegheny region, the West Pennsylvania eldership, without realizing these communities that those first missionaries tapped into were Mennonite communities. Uh, Old Harmony was Mennonite. Uh, Scottdale was the Mennonite hub. It was the Mennonite hub. The publishing company was there in my lifetime, so it had left a huge footprint, and and even up in Venango County, where many of those families that located in 1838, because of John Ayres' connection. John Ayres settled right next to a Swiss Mennonite man named John Latchar, who was the grandfather of the first president of Findlay College, John Latchaw. But that Mennonite legacy through the Latchaws was anchored in that Venango County relational group as well. And some of our uniquenesses about the Allegheny region, some of our peculiarities, some of our shadow sides, but some of what makes us so special is anchored in this Mennonite ethos that we've never really grown out of. We don't recognize it anymore, but it's there nonetheless. And that relational strand, that relational emphasis that I talk about, that's one of the most foundational aspects of the Mennonite communities. And I'm very grateful that the Allegheny region has not grown out of that relational priority in our faith. I mentioned a couple episodes ago about the Laux family, Peter Laux, and he grew up there in what's called the old Stoner community. His farm was just around the bend, across the tracks from where the Alverton Church is now, and that it was called the Stoner Church. There was a Stoner Mennonite meeting place, and as I mentioned, those early congregations met in homes. Some of the early tensions with the Mennonites, and there were some resentments because when people came to know the Lord, many of them were discontent in their Mennonite communities anymore because it wasn't a priority for them. And for those that it became a priority, they gravitated to the Church of God, and a lot of Mennonites left the Mennonite church for the Church of God, and there were some tensions as a result. And even when they it came to the point about building some buildings for meeting places. The Mennonites weren't very happy about that, weren't really willing to help with that. And I think that was some of those frictions. You know, the Mennonites didn't really want to admit to that, but the resentments were still there as well. And but it's as those three communities, Stoners, Bethany, and the Landis community at Hawkeye came together in the middle, in the center. They built that Bethel. Peter Laux was involved in that, and it was named the Center Bethel. Still bears that name to this day, and that's why it has that name. And that that picture of coming together, it's important. We know a lot of territorialism in the church. And when we talk about Weinbrenner, I'll talk directly about that territorialism, about uh, the the frictions and the tensions and the temptation towards sectarianism. Much of what Weinbrenner believed the Church of God was, and wanted to make this group, the Church of God, as a one of its defining characteristics, we have forgotten, we have forsaken, and we've become, mainly through some of the later leaders, we've become exactly what Weinbrenner had been accused of and would not have become over his dead body. But we've kind of lost our way in some ways, and it's good to revisit these stories and these priorities because it helps us find our way again. I think maybe a good way for us to end this episode is to realize that much of what Weinbrenner saw as a priority when he founded the Church of God, um, Christians in America are finding as a priority again. And hunger for what Weinbrenner recognized and was trying to create, and are sick of the fighting and the bickering and the he said she said and the territorialism that in many ways characterizes the church across this country. It's heartbreaking when you realize um, Weinbrenner didn't want it to be like this, tried to prevent it from becoming like this. You know, we're all mortals, and his reach only extended to 1860, but it was anticipated, and it's also part of our heritage to recover. As we revisit these stories and these early priorities, we can grow back into them again, and that's one of the reasons I'm so excited about this series, because it gives us an opportunity to talk about what the Lord wants his church to be like. And well, as we continue to unpack these stories, hopefully you get to see what I'm talking about.
Thank you, Rob. I think we feel, if you don't feel, I feel that itch to come back to what we were, and appreciate you sharing. Appreciate the work that those who've gone before us have done. And as we continue on, remembering that it's the gospel focus and building relationships, and keep shining, keep doing it. And we'll talk to you next week. Thanks, Rob. Bye bye.